spring break, everyone. And a quick note, sort of shopkeeping note, if you will. I'll explain how the sort of order of the classes will change out a little bit better, either online or at a later date. But one of our classes, this is usually the every other Thursday. But April 17th, which is a Tuesday, coming up relatively quick, like everything is always coming up, Newman University will be hosting Father Emmanuel Katongole, who is a priest from Uganda, but he's also a professor actually at one of my alma maters out at Duke Divinity School. And he is going to be speaking about reconciliation in general, but a lot of that, I think, from what I'm hearing and what I know from his classes, will probably bring up a lot of the issues that deal exactly with the martyrdoms of African Catholics and just the genocides in general, like in Rwanda and Uganda. And even though it might not be completely hitting the nail on the topic the same way we would, I thought it was a unique opportunity to go ahead and rearrange the class. So I'm not sure about exactly all the details, but April 17th, which would usually be a Heresy, the Catalyst of Catholic Prayer, we instead will make that a 20th Century Martyrs class. My hope is earlier in the day to be able to meet to briefly go over some of the issues as we sort of do in this class, and then at 7 o'clock that night at Newman University will be the talk. And so more details to come as I get that all ironed out about how we'll do the switching of the classes. But so one of these classes, the 20th Century Martyr classes, will end up being on a Tuesday, April 17th, and we'll do a switcheroo there. So be on the lookout on the website for more details, and when I get it all finished off, I think we have one more class before that happens. Maybe not. Well, we'll get it figured out. Okay, I'll see you guys around. But before we begin, let us pray to Mary, the Queen of Martyrs, for wisdom in dealing with our subject. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's been a while since we last met, and last time we took on the difficult task of not necessarily saying anything new, but when you deal with the Nazis and particularly how it's dealt with in popular culture, it's hard to even approach the subject. It's such a large, obvious, elephant in the room of the 20th century to talk about World War II and the Nazi persecutions. And just to make a side note of that, if you have a chance, I had an opportunity to find a new film that sort of brought up some of the experiences we were talking about last time. If you ever get the chance, a German film called The Ninth Day, and it's about the priest of Luxembourg, and about a priest of Luxembourg and surrounding countries that were put in Dachau, and he's given a 9-day leave, and I won't explain the dramatic action, but if you get a chance from Netflix or you see it anywhere by chance, it's a good illustration, and so I thought it rather fitting that after we got done speaking there, I got a chance to look at the film. But with the Nazis, it's difficult because there's so much known. The Nazis were such good, put that in scare quotes, at organization, and even though they did have a chance to destroy some of their evidence, their experiment, if you will, their sadistic experiment was so short-lived. We got a hold of the accounts so quickly that the sheer brutality of what they were able to pull off in their death camps in a 5 and at most 10-year attempt is it just strikes us as so hard to deal with. It's so blatant and obvious. It's hard to deal with because of the blinding nature of the atrocities. The Soviet Union and communism post 1917, when you start thinking about the sheer numbers that communism in some way was able to inflict on the church, you have to think 1917 to at least, if you want to talk about the fall of the Soviet Union, into the 1980s, if you want to include its reach in Asia, still today, is about 100 years of existence of an understanding and an ideology that in at least the vast majority of its manifestations has considered the direct persecution, or at least the direct making difficult the operations of the church for its entire existence. And the Soviets, I mean, they obviously kept records. We keep getting new KGB and the predecessors of the KGB. We keep uncovering their files. But whereas it's tough to talk about the martyrdoms under Nazis because of the sheer amount and numbers and the difficulty with the Russians, it's like dealing with a ghost town. We go and look at the vast majority of people we know that before and after the revolutions or the different dates of the persecutions. We know that they left the town that they used to live in, but for many of them, they just simply disappear. To read about the accounts of Catholics under the Soviet regime in Russia, for instance, is to almost read about ghosts, about plenty of people we literally do not know what occurred to them. When we look at Mexico or Spain, the sort of fervor of the Republican armies or the Freemasons or whatever we look at, we have definitive accounts in newsprint. This priest killed by this person, killed in this place. And in Russia, we have these lists of people were sent into the Soviet gulags and never heard of again. We don't know what that means. Were they killed? Did they die in transit? Did they starve? Did they freeze to death? There's so many missing persons, and by this time we know, unless some of them magically were living over 115 years of age, we just know they're simply gone, and we don't know what happened to them. To sort of get at the atrocity that the Soviets were able to pull off in the Catholic Church in particular, is grasping at phantoms many of these times. When we want to look at the sort of impact that this had on the church itself, Nazism killed off all sorts of people, destroyed the faith in society and God of many people, but in a completely different way, in this upfront brutality that people just can't imagine was so upfront and in your face. The sort of slow gnawing decay of the religious sense that the Soviet Union and the various communist regimes were able to pull off on people who had been religious for thousands of years sometimes. It's not only deplorable, but also mind-boggling. You look at places like Lithuania, where St. Paul's missionaries founded Christianity. Or you look at Romania and Ukraine, where we in the West aren't as familiar with it, but sometimes Catholic populations that outnumber many of the places we think of in further Western Europe as bellwethers of the Catholic faith. Over all these years of repression, and people will look at the Eastern European nations and think about how atheist they are and how bleak things are. And I don't know, it's strange to have gone over a whole semester of reading about martyrs like we have, and the sense that I've gotten is the brutality of humans towards each other. I guess, I don't know, I'm bored and a nerd and I like reading about history. The brutality of people I've just got used to. The scale of it in the 20th century is scary to think about, but the brutality itself doesn't surprise me. What surprised me is to read about all these places that have had such pointed attacks on their humanity and their souls. And many of these places are synonymous with the faith. It blows my mind. We think about the Mexican people, we think about Poland, we think about Romanians, we think about Russians, and you read in the news about the sort of renaissance that even the Eastern Orthodox, someone said they commissioned a new nuclear submarine, and there's a Orthodox Christian chapel on board. There's this springtime for Christianity, supposedly in Russia. And what used to look as this sort of sign of bleakness, of like the end of an era, to me fills me with, I don't know if confidence is the right word, but I think the sort of tempered hope. Because if the Soviets, in all those years crushing these people, couldn't destroy everyone's faith, if the Nazis with their brutality couldn't destroy all this faith, if Mexico and Spain, these sort of popular movements with all of their sort of headstrong fervor, couldn't destroy the faith in these places, I just don't think human beings could come up with much more to try to destroy it. I don't want to see the next better effort of a regime trying to suppress the religious zeal of people. Because if you read about communism, what it's tried to do, and the fact that people still believe, I don't know what else you could pull off. You could look at that and think about the bleakness, about people being cruel to each other. I guess maybe I'm more optimistic than I ever thought. To me, you read about the martyrs to be thoroughly impressed, not only by the faith, but by people. So Joseph Stalin, just to start bringing up the stories that we do have of people who stood up to the Soviet juggernaut. So July 2nd, 1937, Joseph Stalin, in a long line of things that he issues an order through the Soviet Politburo to all levels of the Communist Party that all former detainees, especially kulaks, political prisoners, and religious ministers, should be arrested or rearrested in order to execute immediately the most harmful elements through administrative steps taken at sessions of the Soviet troikas. And the arrest and rearrest part, yet again, Nazi Germany, people usually get into the death camps or the political camps, stay there, etc. Communism, you read about people who are like arrested and rearrested 3 or 4 different times. The sort of mind games that they try to play, sometimes it might seem worse than the executions that they pull off. So in 1937, Stalin was at the eve of pulling off the most murderous period that he ever allowed, believing that the real communist era was about to begin. And one thing about the communists and their sadistic optimism is you've never really experienced real communism yet, right? That last 5-year plan was just a warm-up. Now communism would finally come. Lenin, he did a good job starting, and then the Ukrainian starvations, but then Stalin got the ball rolling, and then he got the ball rolling again, and then he got the ball rolling again, and then he died, and then everyone in the Soviet Union said, Stalin was wrong. A new springtime for communism. Unless you're from Albania. Albania actually thought the Soviet Union was soft. So if you ever... Albania is even more brutal than the Soviet Union. But then we just have this succession of there's always the next good 5 years waiting to come. And perhaps nothing more scary in history than to hear a communist say the next 5 years are about to get better. Because usually bloodshed was the idea of how they would fuel their next plan. So, Stalin's People Commissar for Internal Affairs carries out the order, and specifically he tells the people to target are churchmen currently to be found in prisons, camps, at forced labor, and in labor colonies, as well as religious formerly convicted of crimes, and then in the countryside and cities, factories, etc. And as Robert Royal points it in a sort of, it would seem flippant, but I think a very telling way, such sweeping measures could not help but produce a large bumper crop of martyrs. And bumper crop seems almost crude until you read the very writings of the people who fought with the Soviets, that exactly what they were doing is fielding a harvest in which the Catholic Church would feed off and grow, echoing the 2nd century bishop, Ignatius of Antioch, when he was getting ready to be fed to the lions. He said, when my body will be crushed by the lion's teeth. It will be like flour at the mill being prepared to be baked into the bread of the Eucharist. So this idea of the martyrs being a crop that is harvested is as old as the church herself. And I like the bitter irony that God is able to cast over his enemies, because in destroying the church's enemies are just harvesting and baking the next loaf, the next acceptable sacrifice to give to God and to feed the church evermore. Now look, communists will try to say Stalin was a particular aberration, but if you look at Lenin, it's very obvious from the beginnings that the Marxist communist regimes, as it took over in Russia, had a very specific idea of the church as an enemy. By now it's very well known that Marx thought that religion was the opiate of the people, and Marx, of course, was not afraid of revolutionary violence, although he never enacted any in his life. But Lenin took this all very seriously, and in a pointed way started to characterize his regime as specifically targeting religion in every detail. So Lenin invents the sort of concentration camps that become characteristic of the 20th century. And the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution begins this idea of words we all become very familiar with: concentration camp, secret police, paying off citizens to report on each other. It's almost like the 20th century couldn't wait to get started with this sort of Orwellian 1984 language. And Lenin was happy to be the person to usher this all in. So he began to put pressure on the Orthodox and other clergy from the outset of the Bolshevik regime. But it was in 1921 through 22 when you'll hear about the great Russian and Ukrainian famine we need a scapegoat. This is what's insidious about it. It's one thing for a cruel dictator to say, we need a scapegoat to help people forget that they're all starving. Lenin actually saw it the opposite way around. He was just waiting for something bad enough to blame on the clergy. So Lenin says, talking about the famine of 21 and 22, "It is now and only now, when in the starving regions people are eating human flesh, and hundreds if not thousands of corpses are littering the roads, that we can and therefore must carry out the confiscation of the church valuables with the most savage and merciless energy, not stopping short of crushing any resistance. It is precisely now and only now that the enormous majority of the peasant mass will be for us, or at any rate will not be in a condition to support them," the religious resistors. So yet again, it's not we need an excuse for why the famine went bad. Lenin goes, what a wonderful time to finally steal everything the church has, to suppress her, and to try to turn the peasant masses against her. So he continues later on, "The greater number of representatives of the reactionary clergy and reactionary bourgeois we succeed in executing for resisting confiscation of the church properties, the better." Lenin wanted this carried out so badly that he asked actually for daily reports about the number of priests that would be killed as this was being executed. So in line with these views of Lenin, and even before the Great Terror of Stalin, the Soviets had gone out after all sorts of religious practice. And when you think about the sheer size of Russia and how it spans from east to west, and all these, in Russia itself, Christians, Jews, Muslims, bordering on Buddhism, Hinduism, all these different local tribes, the sort of vast conspiracy against religion itself makes sense because of the totalizing manner of its claims. But what often goes missing, and not to play any special sad violin, but because of the Russian Orthodoxy's prime spot in the public spotlight in formerly Tsarist Russia, and then oftentimes because when you think about Eastern Russia, it's the relationship of Eastern religions is brought up. the fact that Catholicism itself was especially targeted is missed. And there's all sorts of factors to this. Of course, Catholicism, very early on, is seen as a direct competitor in theory against Marxist claims. So, ever since Marxism had been garnering support anywhere, the Catholic Church had been seen as an enemy just based on thought itself. Within Russia and the sort of Marxism that began to take over, the anti-religious sentiments of Marx, and so people will argue about what part of Marx takes the most precedent depending on who you're talking about, but the anti-religious and the fact that the clergy are especially to blame for the working class willingness to be trampled over is very much brought to the fore. And you have to remember that for Marx doesn't imagine Russia or any place, if you will, that backwards in the Marxist scheme to be the primary fertile ground for the revolution. Marx has England in mind and maybe Germany. Actually, he's writing in Germany, and depending on when you read him, he doesn't think Germany's even ready. Industrialized Britain for Marx is the place to go, a place that's already iffy about religion and already willing to sort of disregard its past, if you will. Russia is a bad fit, even in Marxist terms. And so Lenin and the pedigree of Marxism he sets up has to know that suppression of religion will be paramount. Because in a very old traditional monarchist society like Russia that was by most regards considered the last of the European nations to modernize at all, you have a lot of what Marxism would call peasant superstition to suppress. But beyond that, beyond the fact that Catholicism always was seen as a direct counter to Marxism, besides the fact that Russia has a particularly virulent form of anti-religious sentiment, Catholicism already was seen as a secondary class of citizens in Russia, so that because Orthodoxy was seen as the top, although Catholicism was flourishing much more than even I realized, if you will go look at pre-1917, still many of the Russians, and especially the workers that were so lauded by Lenin and were exceedingly given jobs within the Marxist system, if they were able at all, there is this old sort of prejudice against Catholicism, even if it might not have been as severe, for instance, as sectors of Russian society's massive prejudice against Jews, for instance. Even then, so you have Marxism versus Catholicism on a world scale, the virulent anti-religion of Russian Marxism. You have Catholics as basically second-class citizens in a lot of Russia. And then the trope the Russian communists choose to take against the Catholic Church assures that Catholics are going to meet problems wherever they are found in Russia. And that is because the Vatican is a state. And that so although there's quite a few native Russian Catholics, their clergy is, for instance, mostly trained in France, or their bishops come from somewhere else in Western Europe, every action of the Catholic Church is seen as political subterfuge of the counter-revolution, and that anything basic that you would just imagine a religious person or Catholic doing can be seen as usurping Russia's power. Bishops who would get money from Catholics back home in order to help people out during the famines would quickly be considered garnering capitalistic funds to turn the peasant class against Russia. And so people would be thrown in jail for simply distributing alms or teaching a catechism class, all things seen as anti-revolutionary. And then in the various parts of accommodation that Marxists were trying to reach with individual sects within Russian society, they would almost always try to pit the religious groups against each other. And so the idea would be, look, even though the Orthodox are not Marxist, they're definitely at least Russians. And as Russians, they should, of course, hate the foreigner influence of the Catholics. And so many times, Catholic properties were seized, some of them going to the Russian government, but many of them were turned over to the Eastern Orthodox bishops. And Catholics were told point blank that they had a choice, and that if they could become Eastern Orthodox and have freedom of religion, or if they stayed Catholic, they'd be persecuted. Now, of course, almost inevitably, whenever this would happen, the Russians would still go ahead and persecute the Orthodox. But it was precisely the communist maneuver to try to sit these people against each other. And so Catholics, particularly in Russia, found the brunt of communist agitation against them. They might have been far fewer than other groups of people that died, and that's no doubt. The Ukrainian peasants that starved during the famine is mind-boggling. But Catholics, this is what we're talking about in this class, saw the brunt of a lot of hatred. So according to Father Leopold Braun, an American priest who actually ran St. Louis Church in Moscow, so a Catholic church there, by 1934, the 3,300 Catholic churches and 2,000 chapels on Russian soil, so roughly 5,000 places for Catholics to worship in the Russian world, had been whittled down to 2 active churches. So more than 5,000, whittled down to 2 by 1934. So in addition to the destruction of these worship places, Soviets rounded up clergy, they found active lay people, and like I said, many of these people disappear into the camp system, the Gulag system, and we simply do not know what happens to them. The 2 places, right, the 2 places were kept, it almost makes it worse. The 2 places of worship were kept in Moscow, so when visitors came, they could show, look, here's these Catholic churches. I think one was in Moscow, one was at another place that got a lot of Western visitors, and they drive by and see, here's a place for Catholics to worship. There's religious freedom in Russia, of course. So 5,000 down to 2. So having 2 churches is religious freedom. Okay, so, and like I said, Orthodoxy is the primary Christian instantiation in Russia at the time of the Revolution, but it's had large Catholic populations for a long time, especially if you look at the countries that are in the orbit of Russian political influence. So Poland, which if you know anything about the history of Poland, goes back and forth being considered part of the Russian Empire, part of this, part of that. But as they're always in the sort of orbit of the Russian nation, you have this incredibly Catholic country with millions of Catholics that Russians have to deal with at all times. By the time of Catherine II, there were Germans, French, Italians, and Poles who make largely Catholic congregations within St. Petersburg and Moscow. Lithuania, Galicia, and other places with many Catholics were joined in different ways to Russia, and certainly by the U.S. at the time of the USSR are considered directly in the orbit of Russia. Albania, Romania, Lithuania, parts of Yugoslavia, ancient Catholic communities that are within the purview of what becomes the Marxist empire. So even though Orthodoxy takes this the brunt of what's going on, we can see that Catholics certainly were not some mere minority that it was easy to wipe out and persecute, but in fact took a lot of preparation and work at the hands of the government. So right after the revolution in 1917, well, actually right before, as you know, the Tsar is dethroned and actually murdered. There's a lot of upheaval, but the upheaval at first actually is sort of cautiously optimistic for a lot of these Catholic communities. For the first time, they will be considered full citizens of Russia. When democracy looks like it's going to be taking over, there's actually a lot of fervor, not only for the Catholic communities to be integrated in society, but if you read at that time various people, let me get his name right, I always forget his name. I read him all the time, because I say Russian names very badly. Yeah, Soloviev. Soloviev is an Eastern Orthodox philosopher who converts to Roman Catholicism, and I actually remember the book title. He gives the case, what's considered one of the baseline cases for why the Eastern Orthodox Church should rejoin with Rome, still read by many people today. And so there's actually a sort of case and a reality in the earliest 20th century that at least parts of Eastern Orthodoxy and the Catholics in Russia feel like there's a dialogue happening, that reunification was actually within the horizon of talk. Now, depending on what historian you can talk to, whether that was eminently believable or not, that can be argued. But on the table was this discussion of a new era, a new democratic age, a new freedom of religion, and actually maybe talks with the Eastern Orthodoxy and the Vatican again, talks about reunification. And so, between the Tsar's death and the 1917 November Revolution, there's guarded optimism for the Catholic community that slowly grows as things seem to be okay. And even 2 months after the revolution begins, there's great relief because the Bolsheviks proclaim separation of church and state. What the 20th century's always taught us is what people mean by church and state, of course, is the complete crux of the matter. Church and state, at least seen, of course, in America, at least used to, by some folks still, is that the government will not impinge on the authority of religion to bind its people. But of course the Bolsheviks meant it the exact opposite way, that the state ascendant cannot be impinged on any way by the church, and that the church must be driven into the realm of the private. And when they decide that the realm of the private is only where religion goes, some people thought that this was a decent enough protection, until of course the Soviets made it very clear that they thought your private life was well into the purview of their jurisdiction of rule. So things, of course, turned awful very quickly. By 1919, 2 short years later, the main Archbishop Rop of Russia, is arrested. When the Vatican protested to Lenin, the Soviet leader lied and said it was Rop's nephew, not himself. You'd figure that would be easily shown as wrong because no one was talking to Rop, but I don't think Lenin cared too much. Rop had been arrested, and with other people he'd been jailed as a communist prisoner against the state. 13,000 Catholics paraded down to the headquarters of the Cheka, which is the precursor to the KGB at the time, after Sunday Mass in protest. That night, the government tried to round up several priests. Many of them had to escape into hiding. So people thought, okay, well, this new fledgling government, we can go and show protest, and maybe they'll acquiesce to our demands. But Archbishop Rop was immediately moved to some of the most notorious prisons in the prison system of Moscow. He was later, when he was finally released, he was allowed to live in Moscow's Immaculate Conception parish, but he could never do his priestly duties. He could never be a part of the state. The Vatican intervened and they exchanged prisoners so that Rop was spared rearrest. And so, yet again, cautious optimism floated back in 1919. Okay, bloodshed had been avoided. Things are looking bad, but maybe things will work out decent enough after all. Starting in 1920, and then finally apexing in 1921 with the famine, things go completely to pot. Soviet people are routinely going into churches and doing examinations to see what's going on behind closed doors. They routinely take out the Blessed Sacrament and blaspheme and destroy it and do sacrilegious things with it. They steal people, they desecrate relics, they burn them, they lose them. Catholics begin fleeing in droves to try to get out of the country. It starts to get insanely bleak. In 1921, the Soviet government, beyond just its normal Marxist rhetoric, starts a propaganda campaign distinctly pointed at spreading atheism among its people. So in 1921, they began censoring sermons. Even when the worst czars were on the throne, they wouldn't do this. They create the Atheist Publishing House. They churn an enormous amount of textbooks and material tracts. They spend an enormous amount of money at a time, as we've just gotten in saying. They're entering a famine and they have no money. So the communists will fake money and go into the red in order to make sure that they start to publicize against the faith. Now, of course, the crude blasphemies and the jokes convinced few religious believers. The propaganda campaign was pretty much a massive failure from the get-go. But the vilification did have two effects that in the end would prove very, very helpful. It, of course, inhabited open practice. If you know people are creating tractates about you and publishing them, you know you're not wanted in the public sphere. So, the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church that we were talking about in 1904 literally had 7,000 parishioners that would go through its door. By the early 20s, 100 people would go to Mass at most. In Petrograd, all the Catholic churches were simply surrounded by troops and closed at the end of 1922 and never used again. All 13 Petrograd priests, along with the Archbishop, were ordered to Moscow the following year. I think we don't know what happened to many of them. I'm not sure about that one, sorry. At the same time, with the suppression of the clergy, industrial output starts to plummet. And the agricultural sector famously fails, and famine ensues. And what's insane is the Marxists are shameless enough to ask the church leaders to get aid to talk to the West on behalf of Russia to get aid. So they just got done with about 1.5 to 2 years of oppression, and then they turned to the surviving archbishops and asked them to plead for help from Russia, or for Russia. The church leaders refused to talk to nations to give any sort of pretext as if the Russian government was legitimate, but they did immediately turn within the religious organization. So remarkably, the Western nations responded to Russia's plight after the 1917 revolution, after all that's going on, and people full well knowing in the Vatican that the priests and the Catholics are being rounded up. Pope Benedict XV and Pius XI send Vatican aid, and they petition the League of Nations, and they try to get help on Russia's behalf. That even when Russia is persecuting the church still worries so much about the people to try to get them food, even though it is the Marxist regime whose ineptitude is starving its people. They still were willing to bow and to try to help these people out. So Pope Pius tried to get religious freedom on the agenda at the Conference of Genoa, but most Western nations weakly excused themselves from doing anything. And if there's one thing to say about most Western governments in relationship to the communists, is again and again there's always some more pressing need that allows communism to exert its hand against its religious people. So in 1917, we know, of course, we have the immediate after effects of World War I and the beginning, the sort of start of what will end up being, of course, the global depression. So people have larger fish to fry. Then after World War II, when all of the former Nazi nations are up for grabs in order to make a settled peace instead of being willing to aggressively fight, half of Eastern Europe is given over to the Russian Empire, the Marxist Empire. It was the church this whole time who was being publicly defamed by the Russians, who still tried to help the people in need, especially when the Western nations had too many other things to do to worry about the people that were being killed daily. So Edmund Walsh, who was a Jesuit appointed by Pius, for instance, Pius instructed him to distribute help without regard to religion. Walsh's mission daily fed an estimated 160,000 people in Russia. The Soviet government actually finally thanked Pius for the work that he did in a March 1923 telegram. And if the sort of difficulty that you'll hear about the popes, like Pope Pius XII in World War II, haunts this Pius in 1923. What do you do with a regime that shows itself so ready to starve an entire part of its empire? What do you do with a regime that rounds up people at the least bit of provocation? And so Pius, I'm sure this Pius, Pius XI, could have his detractors as well when it comes to why weren't you more strongly spoke out against the communists. But 160,000 people daily, what does that translate to if the Russians cut off your border? So March 1923 was also the date. So March 1923 was the Soviets are officially thanking the Vatican. In the same month, they also put various archbishops, monsignors, exarchs, and 13 priests and other laymen on a show trial. And as Robert Royal says, the word trial, it's too dignified to point out what often happened, but particularly in this case. People started talking about counter-revolutionary acts, like I said before, and it would basically be teaching children the catechism or giving food to the elderly. Most of the people in this show trial, the very same month that they're thanking the Vatican, died, were tortured, and the people that were allowed to live were put on house arrest and sequestered and never were able to really enter into politics again. In 1925, the number of Catholic priests in Russia had fallen from 245 to 70. And, we think about, in Spain how big the number was, but percentage-wise, this is huge, especially in a country as big as Russia. According to good estimates, 200,000 Catholics just disappear and are unaccounted for in the 8 years following the Bolshevik Revolution to 1925. So, and the way I understand him saying statistics is, those are people that we don't know were killed. We have other numbers for who was all killed, but we have 200,000 Catholics that simply are missing. Now, of course, many of them most likely left and went somewhere else, but we don't know. They don't show up anywhere else. Moscow and Petrograd, like I said, two of the places that have a lot of Catholics. Whole communities of religious people simply disappear. The Dominican nuns, they were simply taken away. And yet again, just to keep up the sad, steady themes that we see repeated, there was a particular brutality shown to women religious, who yet again was even more difficult to imagine them being foreign conspirators than, say, maybe a Monsignor who has constant contact to Rome, or a priest seen as a leader in their communities. Entire orders of contemplatives had their monasteries destroyed and dragged away. And the paranoia it took to interpret some of these nuns as counter-revolutionaries was mind-boggling. So, for instance, the NKVD which was sort of the second generation. There's the Cheka, the NKVD, then you get the KGB. So they would twist what would just be considered normal religious practice and make it appear like it was radical politics. So here you go. Here's a file that represents a woman as confessing that a Catholic friend had told her this. I was the only one to have been selected for a great task. I had to prepare myself for 2 or 3 months under the guidance of a priest, who then would tell me what to do. He told me that I had to concentrate every day on my examination of conscience and on contrition to prepare myself for death. He cultivated in me the sense of sacrifice and readiness to die in the name of a great cause. All this made me into a person fanatically ready to carry out whatever deed to which they destined me, which they're interpreting as they're cultivating this woman assassin to go kill people, but what they're talking about was she was getting ready to take religious vows in the Dominican order. She just had her priest that was telling her how to pray for the novitiate. So this blatant misunderstanding of religious terms is so large, Robert Royal says, as to be laughable if it was not for the murderous end that these women often found. And of course, one of the other things that, beyond the number of deaths we know about, what we have a lot of is confessions of religious and priests advocating their faith, which of course are completely difficult to ever imagine that they might be real. They start to look like form letters, right? I blank, blah, 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 and it's almost like this sort of form. I don't believe in God anymore. I think the church is this. I say that, blah, blah, blah. I think the Pope is an enemy of the people. And even if you did sign it, if people genuinely signed it, the people were heavily and horribly tortured so that you could imagine that they had no control of their wits. The person I was saying about before, Vladimir Soloviev had a son named Sergei Soloviev who was a priest, and he, after the Ukrainian model, like they can marry and have kids. But he was tortured brutally, and he did sign one of these confessions. So he's a rather famous person, the son of a famous convert. So the KGB, the Russians at that time were very proud to have this confession. But they had so brutalized the man that when he got home, people shuffling in the hallway would send him into like apoplectic breakdowns. He would seize up, he started breathing because he thought they were going to come take him and his daughter away. And they had ruined his life so badly that the Russians themselves, when thinking about rearresting him just because of him as a figurehead, when they re-interviewed him, they realized they had screwed him up so bad, they sent him to one of the only actual psychological hospitals they had. They had all these fake ones where they would go and like shock people's brains and all these things, but even the Russians were like, wow, we've messed him up too much. And he goes and he lives the rest of his life in a psych ward because he can never live right again because they've tortured him so brutally. Other thing that they like doing that we have a lot of proof of is they take them to the gulags, and they tried to make sure on every occasion to prove to them the fact that they were in the gulag is proof that God didn't exist. It's a famous bully tactic. You take something away and then blame it on someone else. I'm not giving you this because so-and-so said. So they're pulling the same sort of psychological crap. Father Leone, he's an Italian Jesuit, and he was a missionary in Russia. He was in the camps from 1945 to 1955, so 10 years. A typical incident, he said, would go like this. A camp official, hearing him mention God, would launch into a heated exchange with the priest. God, but if God existed, he would not allow you to be here. And then the priest says, why wouldn't he allow it? Look, I feel honored to suffer for his sake, and I'm certain that he will give me an eternal reward if I persevere to the end. Vain hopes because there is no God, says the guard. And the priest responds, God exists, has always existed, and will exist. while Soviet power, ... Makes the guy mad, of course. The sheer number of people imprisoned in the Soviet gulag is staggering. This isn't just Catholics, this is just the number of people. Estimates of the number of prisoners overall in the Soviet Union begin at 19 million. 19 million, of which 7 million were shot or otherwise killed, or died from overwork, poor food, etc. Now I was trying to think about this. 19 million is the population of Seoul, Korea? It's more than New York City, right? Yeah, I think New York City, is New York City 10 million people? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so, about.
So about 2 New York Cities worth of people were in the Soviet gulags. This extensive network of prisons. Anybody ever gets mad at America about how many prisoners we have a lot of work to do to catch up to the Soviets. They had particular ones for religious. There was this island, I'm going to get it wrong, but the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea. It used to be a religious monastery, and particularly they would send religious people there. And this very bizarre sense of irony, they had these really old, like, bulwark-type monastery buildings there, and they cleared out all the religious and they turned them into prisons. And all of the gulags were, or most of them were actually based off of how that prison on this island works. So strange enough, they took over a monastic look when they made the Soviet gulags. Just one of those bizarre ironies. But an estimated 700 out of 1,000 detainees at this one religious island in 1928 alone died. So 700 out of 1,000. And they would continually send priests there for anything from illegal teaching of the catechism to all sorts of other things. And yet again, the Soviets tried very hard to drive a wedge between the various communities. So the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics on that island had all sorts of, there was a lot of no love lost and a lot of suspicion and hatred, but much to the chagrin of the Soviets, the island, at least for a while, turned out to be sort of seen as this religious mecca. They put all these religious people there, and the Orthodox and the Catholics got along well in the end, and had, saw themselves as brothers in Christ before they decided to very sternly start wiping out religion there again. They go off and on between letting the prisoners have Mass and then go back to totally destroying it, not allowing it. So all sorts of the sort of schizophrenia that they meant to have was just one more way to be psychologically unexpecting of what you were going to do. And that's, there's speculated about why they kept releasing people only to rearrest them. You arrest someone and you put them in a place and you keep the conditions the same, it's going to break people, but there's some people who seemingly could rise to the occasion and could learn to live in that way. So the Russians figured that if you only kept releasing them, bringing them back so that they could never quite fit into their situations, that was the way to make them, to be sure to drive them crazy. And so you let them have the Mass for years at a time, you take it away, you arrest them for 5 to 10 years sentences, let them out. Rearrest them 3 years later to break them down slowly. And so, like I said, this sort of ghost-like nature of the Soviet persecution against the church goes a long way to explaining how difficult it was to retain the faith in all of those years. Quickly, just because you could spend an entire hour talking about these, the sort of, like I said, satellite nations of the Soviet Empire deserve at least passing mention. So the Ukraine, like I said, had a very vibrant community, and since Ukraine, various political dealings make this the reason it is. In 1947, they are under communist rule, but they have a very thriving Catholic community, with a bishop, and I'm sorry, I'm going to miss his name, but Bishop Ramza, I think. They're so worried about him actually causing a popular uprising that the Soviets, who are usually, I don't want to say pretty good, but intent on making sure that anything they do to bishops are not well noticed, are they're taken away, they're arrested in the night, people don't notice it. They just decide to be blatant with this bishop. They haven't allowed him to have a car for a while, so he has to go back and forth in a horse and buggy. And one night, October 27, 1947, the bishop and his companions have an accident with a Soviet armored vehicle, which means that an armored vehicle that is, plated with metal plows into this horse and buggy. Crazy enough, everyone on board lives, and these nuns and peasants drag them to a hospital where they're alive. And not only are they alive, they all start to recover. And so then one day, what day is this one? Right. When in normal convalescence, actually getting better, on the night between October 31st and November 1st, so Walpurgis night, actually, that's kind of creepy to think about. All of a sudden, he was found dead in the morning. But by found dead, what they meant was the communist hospital director, Dr. Abraham Bergman, ordered everyone out of the ward so that he could have a special nurse to come and help him recover. And the special nurse, of course, was a KGB agent who gave him a dose of poison to kill him off. So a man who had survived World War II, the intrigue of Nazis, had lived that long, had lived through an armored car running him over in a horse and buggy. They finally blatantly just sent in a nurse to poison him, to kill him, because they were worried about the willingness of the Romanian people to suffer martyrdom. And this particular Romanian priest would not back down and blatantly stood up against the communists, and therefore received the harsh and direct treatment that they did. Albania, 231. Albania in like I said, Albania has had. I think I might have misstated earlier. I'm sorry. Albania's had Christians since the time of St. Paul, and Albania has been a very strange tapestry of many different cultures: Muslim Turks, Orthodox, and things like this. But Albania becomes the first self-declared sort of atheist state, if you will, according to Robert Royal, where Hoxha, if you ever get to hear about him, Hoxha is the sort of strongman Stalin version of Albania. And like I said, sees everything as Albania being the brother of Stalin, even so that when Khrushchev comes out and says Stalin was too wacky, Albania says, well then forget you, Russia, and becomes friends with Mao in China to make sure, that their communism doesn't go soft. And so, as someone who's not too worried about how soft he appears, targets Catholics, because although Albania, even I think its majority people are Muslim at the time, the sort of figures in the intellectual lights of Albania happen to be Franciscan and Jesuits mostly, who run a lot of the sort of cultural institutions, and systematically he bans the Jesuit and Franciscan orders and mows through them, killing many of them to make sure that their position in the church completely goes away. And like I said, Lithuania, Romania, and then when we get into it, the sort of Asian communist manifestations of Marxism. The onslaught is just so steady and for so long. It's not worth it to look at Eastern Europe and become despondent about how little of the faith supposedly is left. I mean, it's hard to do because you go look at just like I said, the easy thing always to see, because people, they die, they get buried in the ground, it's hard to see them, unfortunately, and of course people are so much more important than buildings. But buildings sort of stand as a symbol, if you will, of the architecture, stands as a symbol of the sort of what happened to those sort of people. And if you ever see the former greatness of Budapest in Hungary, or these magnificent old cities in Lithuania, where, and it's always that's sadly timely, right? That photography just starts being good enough to take all of the pictures of these beautiful buildings right in time for World War II, and then the communists to come and crush them. And if you see before and after pictures, it's just a very telling sign of the destruction of the cultures, the very dense fabric of cultures that live there. But it's not worth it to see that as an indication of the world tearing apart at the seams. It's always an indication to think how it is that these martyrs have like the person said that I quoted, I'm forgetting exactly whose name it was, but this idea of the bumper crop, that willingly they would provide the flour to make the bread for the next generation of Catholics. There's always going to be a price to be paid for the flourishing of the church. Christ, the ultimate price, but other people falling in line. St. Paul and St. Peter say this about themselves, and every apostle and martyr has said this as well. I think it's time for us to say that the 20th century, and I know we're not done, but just the reflection I've had, the 20th century has paid forward a massive flourishing that the church should look forward to. When people will look at the history of the martyrs, I just don't think it's not best to look at what happened and go, look how much that looks like us. And with something like the HHS mandate, or the fact that more and more people in America is finally starting to look like what Europe looked like, is essentially what people are saying. And look, as someone who has kids, and you guys are young, you have friends, it's never nice to think, oh, we could be going through that too. But I think it doesn't do us well to say, oh, here's what happened to these martyrs, look how we sort of look like them, i.e. we're being lined up to be, killed like dogs or pigs. I think what's much more profitable is to say the sheer theological bravery that these people faced it with, and the fact that the Catholic faith survives after such a brutal century as the 20th should fill us with hope that the fruits of these martyrs are just on the horizon, and that as bleak as things look, God has never throughout the history of the church let the price the martyrs paid go unrealized. There's never been a martyr's blood that has not purchased souls and entire cultures for heaven. And when we look at these people and the sheer veracity, we started this off talking about the martyrs of Mexico, and then I hope you guys got to see video or pictures of just how many Mexicans went to the Pope's masses in Mexico, or Cuba, which is more along the line of this, right? Communist dictators destroying the life of the church. How many people are still Catholic in Cuba? I think I heard on the radio they said when John Paul II first went to Cuba, the cathedral downtown in Havana had maybe, like 150 people at it at most at Mass, and now it's over, there's no room. They have to stand in order to make it to Mass at the cathedral. God never, holds the chips. He's always going to turn them in for profit. And it's not worth it to be negative about this. It's always worth it to be prepared to cash in on the hope that these martyrs give us. So, thank you guys. Have a good day. You mind hitting that at the back?
Oh, yeah.